Welcome to Photo Geek Weekly, episode 132, the second live episode of this podcast. I'm your host, Don Komarechka, here with you on, December 9th of 2020. And I'm so grateful to be able to do this type of thing live because I've got a good buddy of mine, Steve Brazel, who's here in the co-pilot seat today, and he's running the board while I get mine up and running because, the first time we did this, we had a lot of positive feedback. Steve, how are you?
I'm doing quite well. I've been telling you for a long time that you needed to do these lives, and I am so glad that we have started doing these shows live.
And, it's the Photo Geekery show. We go into the industry news, whether it's ethics or technology or where we perceive the word photography moving into in terms of public
Both
perception.
Good and bad.
Oh, yeah, exactly. We don't
Story
just...
5. Just saying.
Oh, God. Yeah, we'll get there. That was a late addition, but I just had to add that in. With the world the way it is right now and photography changing, I mean, it's been changing before the pandemic, and there's so many other things that are changing within this world. How do you find yourself, like your own photographic interests? How have they shifted this year? Because obviously, concert photography hasn't been a thing for a considerable amount of time. Are you picking up your camera these days?
Yes and no. I'm not picking it up as much as I wish I could because I really wish that concerts were going right now, but the truth of the matter is I don't see concerts happening anytime until maybe fall of next year, somewhere around there. What I've done picking it up is a couple of things. I've done experimentation with it, and then at Princeton Photo Workshops, you did a live remote class on macro photography, which I think everybody that has a camera has at some point or another experimented with 100 macro or a 60 or 50 whatever macro and tried to do it. But I sat through your class at Princeton Photo Workshop, and that kind of inspired me. So I've tried some of that. I'm looking at getting some extension tubes, and but other than that, no. I mean, the truth of the matter is, and I may be unique in this. I know a lot of people who look, as long as I've got my camera in my hand, I'm happy. But for me, I'm happy when I'm in a photo pit at a concert. It's what I photograph. It's what I love to, or behind the scenes. It's what I love to photograph, and it's really the one thing I care about. I live vicariously through my podcast guests.
Well, and, there have been, you should say, there have been some music concerts and performances. I don't think there should have been, but there have been some, and I would not have gone to photograph them in either way because I don't really play into that mentality. But and I'm glad that you mentioned Princeton Photo Workshop because I've got another upcoming macro photography 4-week course that I've done once previously that was really well received, and so you can always check that out. But we're all virtual these days in this strange world, and it seems increasingly that photography is becoming I don't want to say a virtual endeavor, but a computational one. It's like
yes.
It's not so much as we're just collecting light on a substrate, whether that's a sensor or a piece of film, and that just gets processed to reveal the photons that were detected. Right? That is the traditional element of photography. But our first story is interesting because in the last year especially, last 2 years really, this has become more prominent. And from Petapixel, AI editing will not ruin photography, not in capital letters. It will not ruin photography. And AI, and they say, I'll read the first sentence here. AI is the number one buzzword in the digital photography world, whether it's AI or deep learning or any of those types of phrases. It's just computers. We're getting smarter programming them, making algorithms that can adjust themselves. And there's a lot of experimentation going on in this space. That's not to say it's all successful. And so the main sub-headline in this article is that the photography software industry has pulled a massive persuasion trick on you. And to cut to the point here, and I really want to get your opinion on this stuff, Steve, I'll read this paragraph. And I think that's the most poignant part about it, because there's no turning back from this.
Yeah.
Right? This is only going to continue on.
It's here.
And it's going to continue, and it's going to continue, and so on. So the AI photo editing boom has created a major discussion over ethics. Michael Como is the Como. I'm not sure how you pronounce French names, and I'm of French heritage. Anyhow, Michael, thank you. The AI photo editing boom has created a major discussion over ethics. Is it wrong to use AI to reshape faces, replace skies, to make outright fake images? And will AI change photography as we know it forever? Questions like this play right into the photography software industry's hands, because when you debate the ethics of AI software, you do two things. Number one, you are saying that this is actually artificial intelligence technology and not just a clever angle cooked up by the marketing department. And two,
Right.
you are also saying that it works well. And number one, it's not artificial intelligence. There is no sentience to this.
Right.
And
It's machine learning is really what it is.
It's machine learning, and sometimes it just outright fails miserably. And it's so easy to... I've got some photos of my daughter on a swing, and I turned my iPhone into portrait mode, and it can't properly detect the metal chain link things on the fence. And there's like a random blurry blotch in them because it couldn't figure that out. Like, it was just not part of its equation, and it had a problem interpreting the information. It interpreted the best that it knew, but it wasn't accurate to reality. Now, it will be getting better, and it will be a continuously growing thing to get better and better. But photography has changed. As soon as you started dodging and burning in a darkroom, photography changed from just the flat negative. As soon as you took an image into Photoshop, it started changing from the flat digital file. And do you think that this artificial intelligence stuff is valuable to the core integrities of photography? Or are those integrities simply changing and riding the wave?
Wow, I didn't see you coming with those words. Core integrity of photography, I think, does go to a different place, right? But like you just said, it's not really artificial intelligence. It's a programmer that wrote code to decipher, and portrait mode on an iPhone is a perfect example. Portrait mode doesn't work well on me. My bald head, sometimes it has difficulty making a clean cut around my head. I quite often, if I'm trying a new whiskey, will put the bottle there and put the glass there and try and do portrait mode, and it can't sense the depth edge of that glass that my eye can decipher with no problem. Real artificial intelligence would figure out, okay, it's a glass, therefore it has depth, therefore look at curvature, therefore figure out where the back is. There's a lot of things that could happen in real artificial intelligence, but the ethical part, like so many things in photography, the ethical part is both yes and no at the same time, right? If you're a wedding photographer and a bride and groom get married at noon on a golf course and it's a cloudy, boring day or super bright day and you have to expose for the bride and groom and blow the sky out, is it unethical to make their wedding picture awesome by putting in another sky? No, because it's not photojournalism. There's no integrity issues there.
But on the other side of that, Steve,
okay.
What if you had a moment where it was a gloomy, depressing kind of atmosphere in the day, and you take them out to a waterfront for a photo shoot, and there is just a miracle of a blast of lightning that happens between them, and you capture that for real. It's magical because it actually happened. Putting that lightning strike in between when it didn't actually happen in that concept, I think, is disingenuous. And
and again, I'm gonna say to you then, everything comes down to intent, right? If I am trying to put a lightning strike in and have the viewer, excuse me, we just finished an hour and 20-minute critique show, I'm losing my voice, and have the viewer believe that lightning strike struck right next to a bride, well, that's unethical, arguably, because I'm trying to pawn it off as real. But if my intent is to build a product that a bride and groom are going to like and buy, that a mother of a child is going to like and purchase and effectively vote with green money, then no. I'll go to reshaping bodies and faces, which we do with liquefy and things like that, or even touching up blemishes, right, in fashion photography. The rule of thumb is that you remove things that are not permanent, like pimples. You don't remove moles. However, we've been touching up bodies. We've known it. It's got a word now, photoshopped, right? That's a known adjective, basically.
Used to be airbrushed, but yes.
Used to be airbrushed. Well, I would argue, and the industry has kind of come to see, or at least the customer base has come to see, that that arguably is unethical because you are convincing people that that is the perfect body. And some companies have changed that practice. But again, if you're trying to pawn that off as this is what this real person looks like, yeah, I'd say it's unethical. If, on the other hand, you're making a poster to put text on, arguably not. It all depends on intent.
And that's really important, but it used to be, I remember at the beginning of the HDR era, when you got a lot of really grungy, overly processed, I call them clown puke images, that are just a colorful bunch of nonsense. And
clown puke. I'm now going to have that in my head.
Yeah, you're welcome. So the idea with that was it was so easy to do something bad. Like, it was so easy to just press a bunch of buttons, layer filters over filters, and come up with something that to your sensibilities was okay, but, not a lot of other people would agree. But to do anything meaningful in Photoshop had a certain level of skill required. I mean, not a whole lot, but you had to know what the tools were. Had to know how to use the liquefy tool or whatever else you were trying to do, and do some experimentation and learn how it fails and how it succeeds. But I think that what the big push now is in software is that your desired effect is back to that HDR scale of simplicity of just pressing a button for a preset to say, well, that preset says take off 5 pounds. Oh, that one says take off 10. Let's hit that one instead. And it just does it because it's understanding human form better and so on and so forth. So it's back down to that simplicity, except instead of looking like garbage, it actually looks pretty good. And I think that's the world that we have to embrace right now. Whether or not you choose to do it, it's just a part of the process. And I generally choose not to. I'm sure at some point I might embrace certain elements of that, especially when it comes to upscaling images. And I find that those techniques are really viable for printing purposes. And I don't think that you're really changing reality in any meaningful way. But no matter how you slice it. Sorry, continue.
No, I was just going to say, but there's a couple things that they touch on in this article that need to be addressed.
Please.
Some I agree with, some I don't. So first of all, the author makes the comment that because we're talking about it, because we're calling it AI, the marketing team wins, right? They have got us thinking about it past sale. That's immediately a marketing challenge right there for everything.
Yep.
But they make the argument, or make the statement, I should say, quote, why did digital cameras beat film cameras? Because digital is more convenient. And I'd argue that's oversimplifying when he had the column space to make it more specific. There's a lot of reasons that people switch to digital more than film, beside just convenience. The other thing is he talks about the bloat, that software is becoming bloated with all the AI software. Now that one, I not only agree, but I can give you examples. I remember when Microsoft Word was a word processor, and I used to teach it at the time, and then they started adding graphs if you wanted to import your Excel spreadsheet, and then they started adding image editing capabilities. And Microsoft Office, as we knew it at the time, became extremely bloated, slow running. So there are a lot of things that they mentioned in this particular article that I think I agree with and disagree with, but then he references someone else. And this is where this article stuck me. He references a landscape photographer and YouTuber by the name of Thomas Heaton who did a video called AI Editing Will Ruin Photography as We Know It.
I love this.
And yeah. And I watched it, and really the title isn't kind of how he said it. He posited
it's clickbait,
it as
totally.
Yes, he posited it as a question. Thomas was not being, weird in the way that he said it in any way, but there have always been purists, Always been purists. Film over digital, analog music over digital music, painting over photography when photography first came out, Mac versus PC, electronic versus traditional instruments. Purism of art is not a unique thing, and with photography specifically, to me, and I may be missing some, but to me, there's three things that come into play. It's either documentarian, journalism, or art. And if you as a photographer choose to look at what you're creating as purely art, as long as the post work that you're doing fits what you are seeing your work as, dude, go for it and use it.
I guess to me, Stephen, I think to a lot of people, you're right about those three categories. And there's certain rules of ethics and a rule book that you should follow depending on what you're doing. But it used to be very clear to know that a photojournalist would send the roll of film into whatever media outlet that they were shooting for, and they would scan or enlarge or do whatever that from whatever era of photography, and then that was that, right? That was it. But now the lines are being blurred such that if people are trying to manipulate an image, it's harder to tell. And you can go back to the days of the days of Stalin editing people out of the photographs after he made them disappear in the real world, and then make them disappear in all of the images that he had with
which every divorcee wants to do.
Right. With whatever budget you have, if Stalin could do it back then, you can do it even easier now. And I'm not saying that that's a good thing. But my point is that image manipulation and photography, they've always been hand in hand, just walking forward. And we're at a point now where the lines are blurred so heavily between those three categories that you defined that if somebody says, I didn't edit it, it's very hard for you to prove them right or wrong either way.
Okay, but the ethical breach, is that the right phrase I'm looking for? Ethical breach? The ethical breach there isn't that they used AI. It's that they lied about it, right?
Yeah,
so in other words, going back to the shot, it's not the AI. AI is a tool, and as long as it's used, I always go back to photojournalism, right? There's generally rules in photojournalism that you can crop, color correct, dodge, and burn lightly. Can't remove things, etc. If you take a photojournalistic shot and you edit it to photojournalistic ethics, you're fine. If you choose to clone somebody out, the problem isn't the editing software that you used. It's not the clone tool. It's that you cloned somebody out and then pawned it off as journalism.
And the article has a subheading relating to the video that you had just mentioned from Thomas Heaton. Only you can ruin photography. And that, I think, is really the key, that we get to choose which tools that we want to use, and we get to choose how we discuss it in our art form. And for me, a lot of the stuff that I shoot, whether it's snowflakes or a water droplet refraction type image, the magic is that it's real in camera. And if I faked anything, I would be upfront about it. And if I wasn't, and I was called out on it, it would ruin my reputation. And I don't think that's going to change at all. I think that's always been a part of it. And we need to embrace that photography as a whole is about that art form. The art form will not ever go away, but the baseline of normalcy for ethics, I think, is shifting. Because it's so easy to press a button and take those 5 pounds off and just say, nah, that's how I look.
Well, and Terrell says in the chat, and I always love when Terrell's in the chat, because Terrell is my kind of photographer, right? He's a thinking man's photographer, thinking man or woman's photographer. I think many of these AI products are for the general population that just want their photo to look good, the click and publish set. Pros, hobbyists, and enthusiasts will judiciously leverage the tech. And I agree with that, except I've seen too many times where there's a wedding photographer that gets called out because they just started and they went and harvested other people's pictures and put them in their portfolio to try and sell themselves as a wedding photographer as though they shot the pictures, right? So I think, yes, in general, pros are going to be ethical. Average Joe may not even know what the ethics are But again, it's the photographer, and we all tend to know right and wrong, I think.
And on a slight aside, though, yeah, I'll talk about it. I had a friend of mine send me a note this morning that found a photo of mine on a website, a photo, a website where you can share photos, where you can upload your own content, and that's as specific as I'm going to get. That they cropped out my watermark. Allegedly. I mean, the image was in a proper framing with a watermark on it, and just enough of the bottom of the image was removed to remove my watermark in the crop. So I'm alleging that that might be intentional. They've put their own watermark on the image. And this is somebody in a foreign country that did this. But the company, while they operate in multiple countries that owns the website, they also operate in the United States. And one of the things I typically do is I typically look towards the U.S. Copyright Office has a registry of DMCA agents. So if you're a company that is hosting content uploaded by other people, in order to qualify for safe harbor exemptions in the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, you have to have a registered agent for which I can serve a DMCA takedown notice. It's got to be in the registry. If you don't have somebody there, you don't get those protections. Because how else could I just like send a random email to info@whatever, or you have to have a registered agent specifically defined. And this particular website, this company, did not. And I've sent that information to my lawyer today. But the point of that is that the person took my work, purported it to be their own, and was completely fine with that. And that's somebody that's out in the photographic community amongst other photographers.
And has nothing to do with AI software, right?
It has nothing to do with AI software. People can be unethical all they want.
Come from many places.
Exactly. So, I think that the ethics marker in photography, I really wish we had a solid way to define how an image might be manipulated. An AI software that could go in and potentially detect noise pattern differentials to see where something might be cloned.
That happened. We discussed this a year or so ago. Google came out with a software package that can identify where an image had been edited.
This is true, but it's not open source, and it's not free in an app that everybody has by default that scans any image that they see and shows issues of where things have been modified, squished, squeezed, replaced, whatever. Which, honestly, if I could have a plugin in my web browser, whether it's Chrome or Firefox or whatever, that would automatically scan every image and highlight areas of potential modification, that's the way I would want to view everything. Because it would just add a layer of truth to things that other people are not doing.
Except that would ruin digital artistry in some ways.
But no, I if I could press a button and turn it off and know that it's digital artistry, there could be a toggle switch somewhere.
There you go.
But anyhow, let's move on to our next story, which is one that I don't think we're going to spend a whole lot of time on, but it is the evolution of the computational photography and the ability for us to do more with our imaging devices. And from DP Review, Qualcomm unveils its new Snapdragon 888 SoC, system on a chip, with 3 ISPs capable of 8K video, 120 frames per second still shooting, and 960 frames per second slow motion, and more. I guess the first thing to unpack from this, Steve, is what is an ISP?
Image signal processor. So in every smartphone today, from iPhone to Android, you have an image signal processor that does the processing of the JPEG image. So the sensor captures raw data. The engineers, and that's why a Samsung phone might look more saturated than, in their photos than a photo from an iPhone. Those engineers have chosen to run their signal processing to take that raw image, punch up the sharpness or punch up the saturation at a different amount than the engineers did at Apple. And having 3 ISPs is advantageous for things like what Apple does with their photos when you snap a photo on iPhone. It takes, I think it's 9 photos. It stacks them, analyzes sharpness, and assembles all of those 9 images into one shot, processed JPEG or HEIF image in real time. Having 3 of those means you've got some computational power behind you.
Well, and so you can do some of these things concurrently. You could do entirely. It all depends on what the software engineer, right? You've got a piece of software that's controlling both the camera and the processing hardware, and those two things talk together through the software. And yeah, the default software, as you mentioned, Apple and their portrait mode is quite exceptional. But there's a lot of other programs out there. When we were doing the behind the shot critique show, you mentioned other great apps like Halide, and there are many others too that can go in there and utilize that technology differently. Having 3 of them that could run sort of in parallel to one another and potentially talk to one another during that process. I don't have a white paper or anything in front of me to really dig into those details, but it will allow all of those image processing apps that utilize what we have been calling AI technology to do even more with that. And if I let my mind go wild, it's like, okay, well, could you interpret, and I haven't seen anybody do this yet, but could you interpret proper motion blur? Like as if somebody's running and you want to isolate them from the background and make the background have some motion blur associated with it. And you could probably do that even now. But I just haven't seen people differentiate in those elements, in those structures.
Well, and not to mention the processing power involved in that, even if it could do it now, you're now talking about the first Snapdragon yet, the 888 that is, to have 3 ISPs, and having 3 ISPs gives it that ability. It's not only the first one with triple ISP, but it's triple concurrency, meaning they can all operate at the same time in parallel. So again, the Snapdragon is a system on a chip, like an A series from Apple, like an A14. But from a purely photography point of view for this show, that does give you an increased processing ability. What they're going to do with it, I don't know, right? This is Qualcomm. This isn't Samsung. This isn't Huawei. But when they get this in their system, and when Google starts writing software to take advantage of things like this, if they do, it's going to be interesting. And it translates, by the way, to video too. I should say that.
Oh, yes. And Gary Monroe in the chat said something that I was going to mention, is that you can use multiple cameras at once better.
Correct.
And so on most cameras, or on most phones, you have 2 to 4, and that might even be bigger in some models, different cameras. That the only reason why they can't be used concurrently, or at least viably with all the bells and whistles turned on, is you just don't have enough processing power. But if you have a super wide, a wide, and a telephoto camera on the back of your phone, and it's going to end up using a Snapdragon 888, there's no reason why you don't have the full ability to use all 3 of them at the same time. And possibly, with that information being collected all together from those different fields of view and what have you, then you'll have the ability to combine them together in a better way than we currently have seen, for better depth control if you don't have a LiDAR sensor, and for many other reasons.
And I'm going to go to the iPhone on this, Filmic Pro, which is a professional video app for iOS. I don't know if I'm assuming they have Android, maybe not. I've actually never looked that up. But anyway, Filmic Pro, quite some time ago, displayed a demo of an iPhone where the app was recording all 4 cameras at once: wide, standard, tele, and selfie. And they already have a feature in Filmic Pro where you can choose 2 of those, run them side by side, run them as a picture-in-picture, or record them as completely separate streams at the same time. So you could be walking down a street, filming with the wide angle at the same time as the selfie, doing a blog post, and record you as a picture-in-picture through Filmic Pro. It's amazing what you can do, but it all requires real-time signal processing, which this ISP...
Well, and if you can only do 2
people
at a
commenting
time
that ISPs, they thought it was an internet service provider. And I agree. Acronyms need to be a little more specific. But let's talk about what this thing does otherwise. 10-bit HEIF pictures, First
4K
Android
at
chip to do
120
that.
frames per second. Yeah.
Yep, 120 frames per second, 4K HDR video on 3 lenses, right?
Yep.
4K HDR10, while at the same time capturing a 64 megapixel image. Not that there's any hardware to do that yet, but
the processor can handle it if you build it into the right product.
8K video, does 8K video, and low lux. I mean, this thing...
Well,
it's
I mean,
a beast.
the low lux is yes, signal processing to understand where the noise floor is, but that has a lot more to do with the sensor and that contraption rather than the system on a chip. 960 frames per second. I know that Sony had their Xperia 1, the first edition of it anyhow, had 940 frames per second, I believe. And there has been a number of other cameras that have had that feature. They would run for a fraction of a second at that rate. And so it kind of became gimmicky and it wasn't really that useful. But if you saw some footage taken at that rate of speed with a car that was like zooming down a busy city street and having everything just kind of look like Matrix bullet time almost.
Right.
It was a neat effect, and I've got some creative uses for that on a small scale, yet I don't have the budget to have a just about 1,000 frames per second high quality camera that I could put lenses on and so on and so forth. But if I could put like a moment macro lens on this and just smash it with light and have it run for 960 frames per second for 1 second, if I can hit that threshold, I don't know what kind of buffer. They don't say exactly how long that time frame is going to be for this, but I welcome the return of that feature to a flagship phone. And if you can just crunch those pixels, that quickly at that frame rate, there's some interesting creative opportunities that will come from that.
Well, when I saw the 960 frames per second, the first thing I thought of is how do you get somebody that doesn't understand it to relate to it? And think of it as high-speed videography used in sports. When they're watching a sports event and they slow that footage down to see the person come up and see did somebody get their hand in between them and the ball, something like that, that's high-speed photography. And that's what this is going to give the average person. There's one thing in here I also thought was interesting, really the last kind of big thing I thought, and that is this is the first CAI compliant smart camera. And CAI is Content Authenticity Initiative, which is a way to verify that the images are what they say that they are. Again, this is a chip from Qualcomm that phone manufacturers, or any device really, manufacturers can take and put in their device. The fact that the feature is in the chip doesn't mean the OS of that device will support it. But there's a lot. This thing's going to be neat to see.
And Gary chimes in. Gary should be on the show at some point. He's always got great comments on this stuff. He says, why wouldn't you put this into a DSLR instead of just a cell phone? Well, you could. Theoretically, absolutely you could. Zeiss rolled out with a mirrorless camera recently that runs Android. That an operating system that this chip is designed to function within. So there is no technical reason why it can't be done. And that might be an interesting paradigm shift in the photo industry if that is embraced, if it's seen as
But you're going to have
viable.
the same problem. Manufacturers want to use their own chips.
Exactly, because it's a branding thing. Oh, well, we have the Canon Digic,
Right.
I don't know what they're up to now, 9, 10,
10,
20.
whatever it is.
And so everybody has their own branding. But honestly, I don't care. When you read the comments on like a DP review article where everybody is just at each other's throats through the anonymity of the internet, how many people are clamoring about the Canon digital signal processor or the image processor versus the Nikon versus the Sony? They'll talk about the output. They'll talk about the colors and how they might not be as accurate, but they don't talk about the just the raw hardware inside because we don't know. It's all abstracted from our view. We can talk about the how, but we can't talk about the why. And so I think.
Well, and there's also a throughput difference, by the way. You're talking,
true.
An iPhone is still 12 megapixels. Compare that to a Canon R5, there's a big difference. And that Canon R5 isn't writing to, chips that are built into it for storage, right?
Right.
the Canon R5 is writing to a CF card or an SD card. There's going to be different things happening throughput-wise that you're going to make changes to. But again, it would be interesting for these companies to push the envelope on their processors.
We'll see. We'll see. There's a lot of companies pushing envelopes right now.
They do
Steve.
in-camera HDR.
They do, absolutely, and in-camera focus bracketing and a lot of other stuff that is brand new within the last 5 years, when we had many years in the photographic space where the only innovations were in your head, right? And
Right.
now there's so much more at our disposal. One of them, and that's our next story, is that young Nuo.
Real quick, let me just say, Gary
yeah.
Monroe said, steps back into the shadows. Too late, my friend, too late.
Your voice has been heard. So Young Nuo, Chinese manufacturer, started making flashes, amongst other things, now into lenses and cameras. They have patented a modular camera system aiming to best smartphone cameras, which kind of ties into that same logic of why you can't do this type of thing and marry these places together. But I don't think this will ever see the light of day. What do you think, Steve?
I kind of hope not. First of all, it's only
I hope it does. I hope I can get this and sit it on a
Really?
shelf amongst all of the other anachronisms that I have,
Yeah.
including the little lipstick-shaped Lytro camera and the Light L16 camera, which I don't have one yet. I still want to track one. I just want to have a whole shelf of these things that should have never been made.
Okay, but and yes, I would put one on the bookshelf behind me. But there's a couple of things as far as this article is concerned. First of all, again, only a patent, arguing that you have the mobile terminal with an external lens assembly. Based on what it looks like and what's in this patent, it appears to be micro four thirds, which makes sense, right? They already have, they are a 4/3.
They have lenses for that.
What is it? System standard member or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. But here's one of the things. The patent argues that smartphone lenses lack performance and versatility that people want. But then, which is true on its face, but then it goes in to show these proprietary connectors that you can actually see in this thing. When you look at the proprietary connectors, nobody wants that, right? People are still unhappy that we have a lightning port on an iPhone instead of having USB-C. The last thing anybody wants is other proprietary connectors that they've got to deal with. For most average people, their existing phone is good enough, because these aren't pro gear anyway.
Well, and so you see this, you have a fancy lens and a fancy sensor, and when the two devices are decoupled, right? So that means the lens and its cartridge, if I could call it that, if it's an appropriate word, that's one thing that's entirely useless. It's a paperweight on its own. It does absolutely nothing. It sits in your camera bag, your purse, wherever, but it's too big to fit in your pocket. And then the mobile control unit, which looks like a smartphone, in fact, it could very well be engineered to be one, has a big circle on the back side of it with a sensor inside that looks bare, like it's open to the air. And there is no possible way I would want to use that as a phone decoupled from the device. It would only always be married together, right? So then why the heck would I want to decouple it? Well, the Ricoh had played into this with their, I think it was the GXR camera, where they had a bunch of different modules for lenses and sensors that would sit on the same camera body as a brains, as a processor. But they had the lens and the sensor together. In this case, they're separate. And I think that's just a recipe for frustration, because you're never going to use that device as it's being seen in the patent as a phone with a big bare sensor that as soon as you wrap your hand around, you get your fingerprints all over it. And yes, you could cover that. There's caps and stuff for that.
They make a note that it would need to have a cap in the article. But here's the thing. As a pro, I could see them marketing this to average people, but you've still now got to carry two things that are the size of a phone. And whether it's a phone or not, you got to carry two things. One that's the lens attachment and one that's not. And that's not what pros want. Your phone, whatever it is, whatever your platform is, your phone's already got the AI power we talked about. It's got the machine learning power that we talked about. What pros want, and I've heard people say, I wish that Canon would simply make the back of the phone with no screen and no guts and no processor at all, and let me slide my phone into a dock and have my phone run my DSLR. What pros want is a phone with better glass, attachable lenses, like we kind of have in some ways now.
In this case, the patent, at least the diagrams that we're seeing here, they have no other built-in camera, right? If it is a phone attachment. And so in order to use it as a camera at all, you would have to throw in this cartridge thing for it to actually function as a camera. And that's just, it's an untenable, no, it's not going to happen. So thank you, Young Newell, for wasting your money on a patent. Maybe you get to file a patent lawsuit because somebody violates it at some point. But this is one of those things that, to me, feels like a patent portfolio just grab of some concept that somebody wanted to create that they never will ever fully flesh out, but some portion of it might end up being valuable to them in a litigious way in the future.
Some guy had time on a Friday, and he drew the diagrams, and he wrote a patent around it. And again, you're able to get a patent on an idea without ever having made it.
Yep, so that's what we have, and I don't think it'll ever be. Not to say that, again, I want to see this device. I want to buy it on eBay 10 years later after it's completely worthless, and then add it to my collection. I don't see anybody spending their actual good hard-earned dollars on something like this. No,
I don't see it happening.
But photographers use all sorts of different tools, right? We're not just beholden to the traditional camera technology. A lot of photographers have been using drones as imaging tools. In fact, some have been enterprising enough to use drones as light sources, light painting with drones. And that brought me to story number 4, which was supposed to be our last story, but I just had to add another one in, which we'll get to in a bit. But story number 4 from Petapixel: photographer gets death threats over Utah monolith photos in the New York Times. So I guess we have to unpack a little bit of this, Steve. First of all, what is the Utah monolith?
So in Utah, and they've actually shown up in a couple other places now too, but in Utah, this monolith, which is arguably a misnomer, showed up in the middle of this wilderness in Utah that is a protected area, or should be a protected area.
It's not a big rock, which is what the word monolith means, right? It's not a big rock. It's a big piece of metal. And
it's three-sided. A lot of people think 2001: A Space Odyssey, but no, this is a three-sided object. And it just showed up in the desert. And some people took that down. We'll get into that. It then showed up somewhere else. So somebody's putting these out there is really what it is.
Yeah, and so somebody put this this structure out there, and a photographer. And honestly, if I lived closer to this thing, I might be enticed to go out and do some imagery around it. And that's part of the problem, because
that's the issue, or at least that's the argument that's the issue.
Right, because, it draws an attraction, and you get a whole bunch of people trampling through some part of a canyon that might have a sensitive ecosystem, for that Instagrammable photo, and to carry that forward, and then have more and more people want to go out there. We had an issue a few autumns ago here. It was last year or the year before, where people would storm into sunflower fields and take photos amongst the sunflowers and completely destroy the crops because it was an Instagram-worthy photograph. And so they had to put a stop to that. But the same mentality, I see that applying here. Yes, I am enticed in some way. If I lived close enough to this thing, I might want to do that. And that's a bad thing, because I'm not saying I'm disrespectful, but I'm saying that collectively there will be a lot of disrespectful people if I feel compelled to go out there and do this. So guy climbs up on top of the monolith, as we're calling it, which I don't know if I would do that, because again, I'm interacting with something that I don't know, that I don't know if it needs to be preserved. It's not my choice to make, so I just would stay back. But he's standing on top of the thing, and he's got his drone with a light on it. And he's set the drone to either start right above his hands and go up, or the other way around. It's impossible to tell from the photograph which direction it was going, but it does look like a star is like landing in his hands. I think it's a brilliant image for what it is. I yeah, we could go into an image critique on this if it's not the right show for that. But I do
Right.
enjoy the creative intent of using those ingredients all together to make this image. But what happened next, I think, was critical, right?
Yeah, and let me say, I love this image, right? I think the lighting on the ground, the shadow, it looks like he was holding it and let it go and it flew away. He's got some stars. Nothing other than him and the light above him is really overexposed. I think it's arguably an iconic photo for many things. But he drove 6 hours to see this, right? To practice his quote unquote light painting. 30 minutes after he was there, 4 guys showed up. And they broke this thing down and broke it apart and put it in a wheelbarrow and drove it away. Those guys, Andy Lewis and Sylvan Christensen, told him, quote, "This is why you don't leave trash in the desert."
And we should mention the photographer's name, Ross Bernards. I don't know if we mentioned his name.
Ross Bernard, right.
Yeah.
He's received death threats, though, so have the guys who tore it down. But the key here is, first of all, the threats of harm and hate speech and the trolling is just ridiculous and unneeded. The 2 guys who tore it down live by a leave no trace philosophy. But even he said afterwards that he kind of felt guilty that he went. Yeah, I know. That he felt a little guilty afterwards because he saw 70 to 100 cars in 1 hour. He saw dog poop, human waste, toilet paper all around this. And that's the argument is if you put this, what's the movie? If you build it, they will come, right?
Yep.
And that's the thing is if you put this there, people will come and most people will not care about the nature and take care of the nature. But I don't think he was disrespecting nature. He climbed up on the monolith.
He climbed up on the monolith and assuming that he's there respecting nature, and that's an assumption that we're doing. He made I would say potentially an award-winning image. But we can't look at our own good intentions and our good actions in isolation from something like this because we have so many, I don't want to say bad actors, but apathetic, ignorant, and arrogant people that
Right.
they might not intend harm, but their apathy creates harm.
Or their ignorance.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
And
sometimes it's just ignorance. And Gary said a cool thing, which is true. Gary, I'm just saying, you can't hide. And that is he's going to be able to say that nobody else has this shot, right?
Yeah,
that we know of.
true enough.
Nobody else has this shot. And he had a good quote. I think Mother Nature should inspire you to make art. I don't think you should put art in Mother Nature. I don't totally agree with that. But
I make art in Mother Nature all the time, taking nature into my studio. I mean, so I don't agree with that statement either.
Exactly.
But when I go
here's
out
a question.
Oh, sure.
Well, first finish your thought. When you go out.
When I go out into nature, I will move things. Like if I'm photographing a waterfall and there's an errant twig that has rolled down the waterfall, but it's still in the frame, I'll pull that out because that's like a pimple on somebody's face, right? Like if I waited an hour, it would have probably gone away. And so I'll make modifications like that to a scene. But I'm not going to redirect the flow of water into a different location so that it's more pleasing for my photography. Everybody draws a line differently, and that's just where I draw mine.
But here's a question for you. Let's take a hypothetical. Photographer A, not Mr. Bernard's, but photographer A, takes a monolith in the back of their truck, goes out to this spot, sets the monolith up, climbs on it. Now, understand, this thing is actually buried deep, but still, climbs up on it, takes a picture, just like this, climbs down, puts the monolith back in his truck. Now, he had to dig a hole to put it in, but other than that, would that violate the leave no trace philosophy?
In my opinion, it would not. It's as if you were to walk up there and put a stepladder in there. Stand on the top of the stepladder and shine a light on your face, and then take the stepladder down and haul it away. I don't. It's just an extra couple of footprints on the ground rather than anything else if you're negating the fact that you might have to bury something. So now I really want to replicate this exact scene with me on the top of a stepladder with a with a drone lifting away, just as
Yeah.
a total poor man's version of this kind of imagery that makes absolutely no sense unless it was a parody to this one.
No. The only thing, I mean, I kind of wish the monolith was in the middle of those two rocks, exactly, so that he was in the middle. But other than that, dude,
yeah.
great shot.
Yep.
You
Yeah,
know?
great shot. And I really, I'm empathetic to the fact that he's gotten some death threats and some negative commentary. People can be really mean on the internet. People can be really mean in general.
And it's ridiculous. You know, he didn't.
Yeah,
he didn't damage anything.
It extends. You hear about type anything related to politics into the internet, and you will get such vitriolic commentary, and it doesn't stop there. It flows into the art world. In fact, one might say it started there. When the political landscape was a little bit closer together, the art critics were still at each other's throats hundreds of years ago, and that continues to this date. Human nature at its finest, I suppose, Steve.
Yep.
All right. Well, shall we get into our final story?
Oh, yes.
But before we do, where can people find you online, behind the shot, and your social media presences?
So for social media, you can find me at my personal website, which is stevebrazel.com, and it's spelled the same as the country Brazil, but it's 2Ls.com. The podcast, Behind the Shot, is at behindtheshot.tv, not .com, but .tv. So make sure you visit both of those. As we mentioned at the beginning of the show with Princeton Photo Workshops, super excited that I've got a class coming up with Princeton Photo Workshops on low-light action photography, really focusing on sports and my live music photography. So a lot of the examples I'm going to give are based in live music photography, but it'll cover how you get access to events that you want to photograph, what you do when you get to these events, ethics and etiquette that you follow at these events, and as well how to shoot in these type of low light events. And then of course just here on Photo Geek Weekly now and then.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your contributions to the podcast, sir, and looking forward to whenever I can have you back on. As often as ever is always appreciated.
I love it, and that you're doing the live stream now. Love it.
And Gary says that some people go so far into this whole leave no trace mentality that they'll even knock down stacks of rocks that are put up by other people. Well, I mean, cairns.
You see who else is in there?
Yeah, Jordan Drake is joining. Hey, Jordan. Hope you're doing well, man. And yes, listen back for the full episode when you get a chance. But the cairns, Inukshuk, whatever you want to call them, different cultures call them different things. They've existed across most continents as a way of symbolizing a food cache, a direction, a territory, a burial site, whatever. They've got a lot of don't knock those down. You don't know who made them. I've made some, and I've taken them down when I was done taking a picture of them because I don't want to make something that is misrepresenting. But yeah, everybody's on different sides, and there's so many of different ways to think about that.
Yep.
Okay, into our final story. This one, it broke. Was it 2 days ago? After I put together the show notes, and I just had to go back and add this one to the story. A leaked isocell presentation slide, and this is reported by DP Review, good folks there, suggests that Samsung is entertaining the idea, okay, just put it there, of a 600 megapixel smartphone sensor. Okay. Let's, again, it's something that we can't just take at face value. We got to dig into this a little bit, open up the box, and take out all of the frivolous bits and pieces of information until we find something tangible, which starts with the isocell technology, which they're using right now, which basically it's kind of like a pixel binning technology where you don't get that as a resolution. If you have got a 60 megapixel camera, you'll end up with like a 12 megapixel image. You're just collecting the data separately and using software interpolation to figure out how it should all gel together down to the final end product. And I've had opinions about this in the past. I've thought that it was useless. I've thought that there are better ways to do it. And I've thought that, you know, if you need to go down this route, you have to create a huge amount of processing overhead to just deal with this information rather than making a better sensor if you're only going to be dealing with a 20 or 12 megapixel camera to begin with, right? Just make good pixels, good 12 pixels, because we see that in all the other cameras that we deal with. I don't know why we need another approach here. But the idea, I'm laughing here because I'm having a hard time actually putting this into any practical sense. You'd need to have a bigger sensor, obviously. There's just no way around it for the physics to work on a smaller sensor. And if you have to have a bigger sensor, you have to have a bigger lens. No matter what focal length you're dealing with, this thing is going to get chunky. How chunky, Steve?
Well, I've got it on screen right now, and let's just say this is going to be one of those moments where somebody walks up to you and says, "Are you happy to see me?" or "Is that a Samsung in your pocket?" This thing is just no, okay? Just no. Nobody wants this thing. I don't believe that nobody needs 600 megapixels on their phone. The truth of the matter is most people are sharing their pictures on Facebook or Instagram, and nobody needs that resolution. Don't come to me with the cropping idea that, oh, it gives them room to crop. Nobody needs to crop out of 600 megapixels.
And even if that goes down to 60 megapixels, 40 megapixels, 20 megapixels, still, then what the heck was the point of going to 600 to begin with?
Why? You don't need it. You just don't need it. Nobody has... The only people that look at a smartphone right now and go, I don't know, the iPhone's only 12, are pundits on YouTube things. The average person has no problem with the resolution of their Samsung Note or, Galaxy or iPhone. They just don't. And the problem is you're also dealing with physics. This thing is going to have 0.8 micron pixels.
Which is actually
the new iPhone Pro
small.
Max. That's small. The new iPhone 12 Pro Max. It's a big deal that camera, one of the lenses, I should say, one of the cameras on the iPhone Pro Max, is a 1.7 micron pixel in a phone. And that was news.
Well, okay, so that's
0.8 is not positive news.
Right. Well, but it's twice the size of this, and the previous generation was less than half the size as this here. So we're not dealing with significant orders of magnitude in pixel size in order to generate the resolution that we're seeing. But to get this big, it looks like you were to take 4 dice together. I think that's a proper measurement. But 4 dice, stick them together, and glue them to the back of your phone. And is that a usable device? You know what? Maybe it's 9 dice. I'm not sure. It's hard to say based on their references or somewhere in between. But it's big. And if people want the inconvenience of a good camera, they're going to carry a good camera. They're not going to try to marry that to their phone that will forever be an inconvenience when you could have a separate device that, is the impassioned photographer's tool to make a good image. And
Gary brought up something in the chat that I do have to mention because I've said on your show before, the key differentiator for phone photography, for mobile photography, is going to be when they get better low light and better zoom. Until they get the equivalent of a 200 millimeter zoom has always been my argument. We've got wide that does great in the right light. We've got medium 58, 65
why
millimeter
are you trying to
that
justify
does.
this, Steve? Why
I know.
Why are you on the side of this?
Okay, but I'm just follow me on this though. So, but the argument could be made that if I can't say that mobile photography will take the next step when you can do a 200 millimeter zoom and not recognize that cropping a 600 megapixel photo could get you kind of... Are they simply trying to work a different way around the optics?
No, well, I think that it's the same thing.
You see what I'm saying? Does that make any sense?
It does, but their current generation of 108 megapixel tetracell technology, whatever you want to call it, that doesn't give you a 108 megapixel file. It gives you a much lower resolution version.
Right.
And so you would be better off to design optics along a longer optical path with a smaller sensor in it, like those periscope sensors that we know that Samsung, I believe, is also playing around with and experimenting with. And so that's where you have a first surface mirror and some optics, I believe, on both sides of that. But most of the optical path is horizontal, and then it shifts towards out the camera. And I think that's the more viable solution than having this big brick on the back of your camera, which nobody wants. And
Right.
and if anybody complains to me, and send me an email at don@komarechka.com, if you want a camera like this, please discuss your reasoning as to why. I expect no feedback on that point.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I don't, I want to, it's like the last one. I want to see this just to see it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and that's maybe that is a reason for an in-person trade show to exist in the future, for all of these wacky prototypes to actually
There
get
you
some
go, yeah.
hands-on life and to see them in person. But I don't think it's going to happen. Hey, Samsung got some patents now, I'm sure. Again, everybody's patenting everything these days, and I guess that brings us into our picks of the week, which I do believe there's patents involved in both of our picks to some level. It's a terrible segue.
Probably.
But there's a device. I actually have an original from a company called Looking Glass. And I'm just dragging it up here if my voice trailed off for a minute here.
Is it that heavy?
No, it was just barely out of reach. I'm poor at planning such things. And I'm unzipping this device. This I backed the original Kickstarter of. This is a Looking Glass holographic display, and it's chunky and reminiscent of that Samsung camera module in terms of the device as you see it. This could display things in 3D from different angles, and it's cool. I've used it a handful of times just as a novelty. I've translated some of my stereoscopic 3D images to this by building depth maps for them. But the company is coming up with something new, and I jumped on board for this one. It's called the Looking Glass Portrait, which is a much thinner, more mobile, holographic display. And I know I did a 3D pick recently, the Loom Pad, which is also awesome and I'm still using quite regularly. But this is currently on Kickstarter, and they have raised, at least in Canadian dollars, it's showing me over $2 million, probably just before $2 million US. And they've added so much functionality to this device, including the ability, and this is where it becomes useful to just about everybody, is to take photos taken with the iPhone portrait mode from the latest phones, which have embedded depth map information, and instead of translating that into a background obfuscation in blurring stuff in the background, what if you could use that in order to make the image into just complete 3 dimensions from every possible angle, and not just for photos, but potentially for video as well. And so I got in at $199 US for this. I think it's more expensive now because that was the early bird, but it looks like it's only $249 now if you want to get in to a device that can take stuff readily available from your smartphone with depth map information. You can generate your own. There's lots of other ways to do that. And show it in a 3-dimensional depth that the world has not seen with this level of ease and convenience before. So yeah, they got my money. I voted with my wallet on this one because I really think that, especially with the amount of money that they're getting and the software suite that they are designing behind this, that it's going to be a really fun thing. I don't have my hands on it. I have had my hands on their previous products, and so that's why I'm making it my pick sight unseen. And I think that this is going to be, especially with the interest in it right now, this is going to be big. This is going to be a paradigm shift for people that are making depth-related content, and it's the tip of the iceberg. So that is my pick.
Well, and I had up, they've got an animation on there showing it in use on the Kickstarter page that I brought up on screen, and they've got a memoji on there, the iPhone memojis that are like, what was it, a panda bear or whatever it is. And that's kind of cool, the way that they're doing it. I kind of dig that.
And could you imagine if you could adapt a camera to this and have a holographic video conference with somebody? Obviously, you'd have to have two people with the same device, and that might be a small number unless you buy two of them, and you give one to a loved one, a grandparent or parent. And there is a kit available, and there's multiple cameras that can interface with this properly that generate depth maps, and you could do video conferencing with this and feel like you're close enough to being in the same room with the people that especially if they are of advanced age, you probably haven't seen this year, even though you really want to. And Christmas is coming, and I don't think this is going to be out for Christmas, but you want to have those family moments that feels like you're right next to somebody, and so many of us are not getting those moments this year. And there is ways for technology to bridge that gap a little bit.
The looking glass hug.
Yeah, there you go. And Gary,
I tried
nobody
just
asked
bringing
for
something
those 3D
else up
screens, but we got them.
Yeah. I tried bringing something else up on screen, and of course, every time I do that, the app that I open loads on this screen and pushes Don's video off. So if you see that in the video where suddenly Don slides off and slides back in, I'll own that one. So my pick of the week is a piece of software I don't think I've ever mentioned. I may have mentioned it, but haven't picked it before. And the sale is about to end. In fact, yesterday I got an email saying there was one more day. It's still up there, and I'll show it to you here in just a second, but it's from Isotope. It's Isotope RX8, which is a new version of the Isotope RX suite.
What is Isotope?
Isotope is an audio repair suite of tools, and it comes in 3 versions. It comes in an Elements version, which is like an entry level and gives you most of what you would need to repair audio at a certain level. Then it comes in a standard version, adds a few more tools, and then it comes in an advanced version and adds a lot more tools. Well, the Isotope RX suite, Elements, is normally $129. That's on sale for $29. All of the Element suites, normally $129, on sale for $29 each. But what you're looking at on screen right now is the Isotope Holiday Bundle. And in this Holiday Bundle, you actually get all of these items at the bottom, current versions, RX Elements, Ozone Elements, Neutron Elements, Nectar Elements, Trash, Iris, a bunch of other stuff as well. But just the 4 Elements packages are normally $129 each.
What do all of these different packages do? Like, I mean, I understand why you might want to run different filters or processes on things, but just kind of throw me a little bit. Don't explain everything, but why are there so many different things?
Okay, so I'll give you some ideas. And let me just say, for $49 instead of the quote-unquote listed retail of $1,200, this is an absolute no-brainer. This is the industry standard for audio repair and audio mixing tools. So RX Elements has denoise. So if we're recording this, I can denoise something. It has audio repair, where I can bring up our audio in a spectral view, see an ambulance that went by outside, select it with a tool and say replace it, like an autofill tool in Photoshop, and it will fix that ambulance. You can do, for example, in Nectar. Nectar's great for voice. It's got fantastic compressors and EQs and noise gates. Neutron and Ozone are more for music mixing, but also have stuff that you can use for voice only. And hey, you get them in the package for $49. There's just some killer stuff in here that I use on a very regular basis, the Isotope RX suite. De-reverb, so if you're in a room and you get a lot of echo, here's another one that I've used, de-bleed. So sometimes I record my podcast, and I'll use Don as the example, although it has never happened with Don. My guest will have their headphones too loud, and they're in the UK. Their headphones bleed back into their microphone, meaning my voice goes onto their audio track about a second delayed from me. So when I put those 2 audio tracks synced up together, you hear me talk, and then you hear me talk again on their channel. The de-bleed will help you remove that very quickly, very easily. De-hum, de-hiss, de-noise, RX Elements is just a great suite, and for $49 to me, it's just an absolute
As
no-brainer.
soon as you describe D-Bleed, I hit add to cart. But before I actually commit to buy, is it Windows, Mac? What platforms?
Well,
is this
it's a
on?
plugin. It's a standard VST plugin.
Oh,
Now,
okay, so
RX
it's
Elements also has a standalone app. I have the standard version, not the Elements version of Elements, because it gives something called loudness control, which lets you set the standard loudness for a podcast or a video to industry standards. But they do have Windows versions as well. And for $49, it's just such a great tool. And I will say, I'm going to give a plug to these people, and I don't know who they are, but I think it's ask.video, has an entire class on isotope elements, neutron, ozone, and nectar, current versions of those with different instructors. And if they're inexpensive, it's like $15 for a month. But you can also watch 5 videos a day for free. Cool. And for example, there's probably 20 videos in the RX class that are some great information, but those videos you can go watch, 5 a day for free, and then support the company too. Pay for it if you like it. So,
why, thank you for a wonderful pick, Steve. You're spending my money here today. Here
to help.
Well, no, legitimately, if that does save me paying somebody else to do it because I've got the software readily available, then I'm totally game for that. To be permanently and properly equipped, rather than having to nickel and dime out subscriptions for so many different services, of which I have way too many as it currently is. Yeah.
Well, you use a service for your podcast called
Ophonic, and they now have a standalone version, which I'm eyeing very seriously, so that I could just pay that one-time fee, run it through it, process it locally, and hopefully get the same results. That's just a leveler, and it's a system to remove some of these things like hums and hisses, and but it doesn't do anything nearly as powerful as that D-Bleed thing that you mentioned, and that's a problem I've had with some guests as well.
And let me just show this really quick. This is Terrell just said that he got the bundle with his Focusrite for free. So if you've got the bundle on all this RX stuff, this is the site I was talking about, which is ask.video. And, you can get it for 12 or 15 or something like that a month. It says 12 here, but other places I've seen 15. You can own it for life for $30, the entire RX video manual. And when you go look at, I did it in that one, so let me jump out of that. When you go look at the actual RX suite, this is what you get. And let me just show you this really quick here, because it'll make more sense if I can find it. There it is right there. So this is RX 8. And when you jump into RX 8, you'll see some of the tools that they have down here. So surgical, this image on the left is that spectral repair, where you can select, that's somebody whistling at a concert. And they're removing the whistle by selecting it and saying, hey, go replace that. And it's kind of like autofill. Spectral recovery, guitar denoise. There's just a ton of stuff in here. And
that I have to say, if you dial it back 10 years, the audio equipment required to do this would cost you more than my car.
Yes. And here's what the Elements has. Repair Assistant, dehum, declick, which is another really good one, by the way. Declip. Now, declip is an interesting one, and I've used this, where I didn't realize either I or my guest was too hot, and the waveform clipped. What declip does is it uses machine learning and artificial intelligence to rebuild the waveform, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Voice denoise, tons of stuff in here.
All right, Steve, that is an exceptional pick. We're photography related, but I do so much video work now, podcasting, and so many other things where audio is becoming more and more important. And to put these tools on everybody's radar is a great service. So I appreciate that, and I thank you for that pick. And that winds us down to another finale of the podcast, the final send off, where I say usually thank you for listening, and any feedback, or especially feedback on the live episodes. It's really helpful for us to build this out, flesh it out in a way that that will be even more conducive when I take the controls away from Steve. And thank you to everybody that was watching live, and your commentary has been fantastic. And so with all of that said, I appreciate everybody listening. Thank you so much for being here, and stay creative out there. There are so many ways for all of us to pick up our camera, shoot something that we haven't done before, or that just makes us happy, spread more happy in the world, and stay in and shoot.